Greetings, you curious Herle Burlyites. The pod today is nirvana for polling nerds like me and anyone who's just curious about why Canadians who don't live and work in the Ottawa bubble are thinking what they're thinking. Our guests are two fantastic pollsters I've wanted on this show for a long time. Dan Arnold and David Colleto are here. Dan has a master's in statistics from the University of Alberta and began his research career at Pollara, where he led projects for their biggest clients. In 2014, he joined the Trudeau Liberals as their lead research strategist and oversaw the party's research in the lead up to their historic third to first 2015 majority election victory. And he did it all again in 2019 and 2021. He also played a prominent role in the PMO as Director of Research and Advertising. Dan rejoined Pollara about 20 months ago as Chief Strategy Officer. David is one of Canada's best-known public opinion analysts and social researchers. He's the founder, chair, and CEO of Abacus Data, where he works with some of North America's most respected brands. He has a PhD in political science from the University of Calgary, dueling Albertans here, and he's an expert on voting behavior and the intersection of public opinion and public policy. Not only that, David teaches in the graduate program of political management at Carleton. So today, with that kind of expertise on the pod, I want to focus on a singular topic. The multi-year logjam in polling between the Liberals and the Conservatives, never more than 2 points away from one another, appears to have broken. The Conservatives have opened up a 10-point lead. What's happening out there? Who's moved and why? Is there a road back for the Liberals? And what might be the clinching argument for the Conservatives? David, Dan, such a pleasure to have you on the Herle Burly today. Where do I find you? Dan, do you still hang your hat in Calgary?
No, I'm in Ottawa, but I get back a fair bit to Calgary.
You decided to make Ottawa your home.
It feels weird. I know. Poor choices, but
Yeah, David, you're in Ottawa too.
I'm usually in Ottawa, but I am in Portland, Maine today on vacation, enjoying the Atlantic Ocean and all that is great in Portland.
Well, thanks for breaking up your vacation to talk to us. I didn't know that.
This is going to make vacation fun. Don't worry.
Okay, so can I start with my big question? Just leave that as for both of you to comment on. David, you've got the most recent public data I've seen, so maybe I would start with you. Your last public poll showed a 10-point lead. You've intimated on social media that is continuing, although we haven't seen new data. 338.com says the consensus is 8 points lead for the Conservatives. Dan, your last public work is a couple of months old and showed the old tighter race. But you also showed some of the trends in key constituencies that have shown up in bigger terms in some later work like David's. So, David, what has happened to create this now large Conservative lead?
Well, David, we just finished a survey yesterday. 1,600 plus Canadians has a 9-point Conservative lead. So nothing seems to have moved from 2 weeks ago. The cabinet shuffle, didn't move the numbers. I don't think anyone expected that. It's summer, all that kind of stuff. But I think, in thinking about that question, there's no doubt that something's happened since, I would say, early July, end of June, that has really pushed people away from the Liberals. I think that's what's happening. I don't think this is a real attraction to the Conservatives, more from something's pushing them away. And I look at three other indicators. Direction of the country, at 26% think that it's headed in the right direction. That's the lowest since I've tracked that number in over 5 years. The government's approval rating, generic government approvals at 31%, the lowest since April 2019, which was the SNC-Lavalin controversy. And then finally, Trudeau's personal brand is at minus 23, 29% positive, 52% negative. That's the lowest it's been since 2015. So if you look at all those other indicators...
Can I just stop you for a second, just to be clear? On that last indicator, in 2021, he was even unfavorable and favorable, correct? So between the last election and today, a 20-point swing has emerged in Trudeau's personal numbers.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So all of those to me point to something big happening, which I think I'm going to chalk it up to inflation. I'm going to chalk it up to people personally feeling a lot of anxiety and it all just pouring onto the government in every way. And so incumbent governments just get pummeled because of inflation in these kind of times. And it just took time for that to build. And I think the last government Bank of Canada interest rate hike was that final signal that this wasn't over yet, and that there was going to be some more hard times for those that have mortgages and have lots of debt, that it's continuing, and that inflation, although it's coming down, prices aren't coming down. We always have to remember that. Like, we see these headlines that say inflation down, well, the prices aren't coming back to what they were in 2021.
Dan, what's your take on what's going on out there in the big picture?
Yeah, I mean, I think the why is the thing that's probably the most worrying from the government's perspective. Like, when I was in government, and David mentioned SNC-Lavalin, like, you go back to March 2019, Liberal poll numbers were going down. Pretty obvious why they were going down at that point. And in some respects, that's kind of comforting. It's almost like, when you get the medical diagnosis, you know what's wrong. Like, we can treat this, we can figure this out. And you just kind of hope also the time will just heal things, right? If it's a big shock that causes your poll numbers to go down, people eventually move on to the next big shock. Something else will happen that will kind of distract them, and there's a bit of a regression to the norm there. I think if you're in an environment where things are going down and there's not an obvious reason why, that's a little worrying from the government's perspective, I think. And unless you think that Canadians really don't like opposition leaders who wear glasses, there's nothing obvious that's happened in the last month or two that would explain why things have gotten worse. So I think in the absence of that, it's probably a lot of what David said, right? Economic anxiety, economic frustration, just general time for a change sentiment building over time. Abacus, I know, does a lot of inflation polling. Pollara does as well too. Majority of Canadians think inflation is going to get worse. People don't care that inflation is 2.8% instead of 3.8% or whatever. That they care about is that ground meat is still pretty expensive at the grocery store, and gas is still $1.60 a liter, and interest rates are going up, which isn't going to help you pay your mortgage, right? So, in that situation, you're looking for someone to blame, and I think this government's a pretty easy target in that respect.
So, what's interesting? The Liberals are getting absolutely trounced in the age group of 30 to 60. And they're, relatively competitive with young people. We can talk about that maybe later. And very competitive among older Canadians. But in that middle-aged group, they're just getting hammered. In my polling for Gandalf, I'm also seeing those people as the most economically distressed people in the country. The people that are expressing the most anxiety about what's going on are people in that age bracket. Is that the relationship, that these people are feeling economically distressed and just turning against the government for it? Or is there some other reason why people of that age bracket don't like this government? Either one of you.
Well, I think first, David, that insight's really, really important. And I think I see it too in our data, right? Like the anger or the anxiety among that cohort. And I think if you think about it, they're the most likely to actually have debt, significant amounts of debt, right? If you're over 60, or exactly, through a mortgage, right? And so if you're over 60, you most likely have paid off that mortgage. And in fact, you have savings, that a rising interest rate actually is a good thing, right? You see upside to interest rates hitting 5-6%, you can make some money finally off of those savings. So I do think that is like the sweet spot for this economic anxiety that's now turning into political pain, right? And if you think about that 30 to 40 group, that's like the older millennial cohort that was fundamental to electing Justin Trudeau the last 3 times. They're now increasingly homeowners. They could get into the market. They're feeling the pressure of probably over leveraging themselves and seeing no hope yet to get out of that.
Right.
Yeah, I think the Liberals have built up a lot of goodwill among older voters, especially older women, over their time in office. I think COVID had a lot to do with that. Like, we definitely saw a lot of older women very, very positive to how the PM handled COVID. And I think that has stuck to some extent. And I think that's also a group that are maybe a little bit more apprehensive about the type of politician that Poilievre could be, this more sort of populist, radical type of politician, untraditional. And I think, for that reason, a lot of older voters have kind of built up this affinity towards the PM over the last couple of years, and are probably less likely to jump away because they're not feeling those same pressures that David mentioned when it comes to economic pressures.
Right. Dan, when I look at what's happening in the polls, the most electorally significant change is probably in Ontario, where it looks like the Conservatives now have opened up some sort of relatively significant lead in Ontario, and that's obviously foundational to a Liberal government, is a pretty big number in Ontario. Where in Ontario is this happening? Are they doing what they're doing in the West, which is piling up margins and seats they already hold, or are seats changing in Ontario?
Yeah, I mean, elections are not won or lost in suburban Calgary. I think that's fair to say. They are won or lost in suburban Toronto. That's been the way ever since the first houses went up in the 905. I imagine that's probably been the prime real estate for political operatives in Canada. So I think, the Liberals have built up a bit of this sort of this red wall, I think, around the 905. If you look at the last two election campaigns, if you look at the number of times Justin Trudeau visited 905 ridings, if you look at the issues like gun control last campaign, like those were clearly issues that were meant to reinforce that Liberal fortress around Toronto, and it has held up. And I think, in some respects, like this polling we have shows Liberals are still doing quite well among a lot of new immigrants, a lot of South Asian, East Asian voters. So, I mean, that will help them in those communities there. But there's also a lot of people with kids who have a mortgage and a lot of expenses in those ridings as well, too. I think that's something that is going to be the competing pressure that they're up against there. And, certainly if you're losing Ontario as a Liberal Party, there's only so many votes you can lose in, Northern Ontario and rural Ontario. Eventually those votes are going to start to disappear in the 905 if you see top line numbers like we're seeing right now. So I think that's certainly still the battleground as it is, every campaign.
And David, think about like the psychology of particularly a homeowner living in the Greater Toronto area who for the last 4 years has felt incredibly wealthy, right? That the value of that home has gone up, I don't even know, 30, 40%. And then all of a sudden, if you've got a mortgage on that, you're now feeling the opposite, right? So it's this like roller coaster of economic insecurity that I think has created this opportunity for the Conservatives to speak to voters across the country, but in particular in the Lower Mainland and in the GTA, it's something that I think is, and you look at sort of the difference between those who rent and those who own. Conservatives have always had somewhat an advantage there, but that gap has grown substantially, and those homeowners are now, I think, coming away from the Liberals in larger numbers.
Right. Dan, you did a big 7,000 sample. David, you're doing big samples too, but 7,000 is pretty big. You did a big 7,000 sample. Who are the new Conservative voters? How would you describe them demographically or psychographically?
So, I mean, like when we did the poll in June, to be honest, the Conservative vote wasn't up a lot from the last election campaign. Liberals were down a bit, and that bled a bit to the NDP, a bit to kind of just people drifting into the either whatever the convenient none of the above option is, or undecided at the time there as well too. So I think, in that respect, I'm not sure the Conservative gains have been that significant. Even the polls that have the Conservatives up by 10 points, they're up by 3 from the last election campaign. So I don't think it's necessarily a case that they've made massive inroads. I think they have seen some progress among middle-aged men. They're certainly trying with younger voters. I mean, you see Poilievre, even his ill-fated, Bitcoin play last year, but more productively on housing. Like, he's definitely making a play to younger Canadians and a lot of those disenfranchised younger men, I would say. Younger women are still very much, in NDP land, kind of flirting with the Liberals, and maybe I'll go there if I'm really afraid of the alternative. I think younger men are drifting more conservative, and I think that's something that the Conservatives certainly see as a path forward for them. But, geographically, yeah, I mean, it's Ontario and it's Atlantic Canada, I think, too, is an area they see. The same reason I always wonder why, like, progressives in Calgary and Regina don't vote for progressive parties. You got to wonder why these people in rural Atlantic Canada don't vote Conservative. I think the Conservatives look at those voters there and say, anywhere else in the country, people who live in these types of communities are voting for us. They're not in Atlantic Canada. So I think they see that probably as a bit of a growth market as well, too. You add up 3 seats in Newfoundland, a couple in Nova Scotia, a couple in New Brunswick. You can start to get numbers that are actually meaningful at the end of the day there.
Yeah. You mentioned men, Dan. Can I just stick with you for a second? What don't men like about Trudeau? Policy, personality, combination, what is it? But I mean, if you look at, sort of middle-aged men His numbers are pretty brutal in that demographic.
Yeah, that's true. I think, I think part of it is that, middle-aged men especially are the ones that are most focused on these types of economic issues that they care about. They probably don't care about what Trudeau's doing on the environment or on Indigenous issues. They're going to be very much driven by economic ballot questions. And if that's where your ballot question is, you just naturally drift a bit more to the Conservatives. I think at a personal level, it is true that, his personal numbers always tend to overperform a bit more among women than among men. I think he is seen as a bit more of if you're dividing politicians into that kind of archetype of like the tough, strong leader versus the softer, he understands my problems, he cares about me. Trudeau's always been much more on the he connects with me, he cares about me persona. And I think that one is a type of leader that generally plays better among women than among men.
David, yeah, I mean, we did some stuff with the Toronto Star a few months ago, and if you look at men who don't like Trudeau, they overwhelmingly think he's feminine. They think he is weak. They think he is phony. And so I think personality and their impression of his character plays a big part. I mean, just this past few days, him posting a photo of wearing a pink t-shirt, going to see Barbie, like exploded social media in not a positive way. And that's just reflective of the way he
14 million views.
He triggers, like there's a subset of men particularly that he triggers, and that's been there from the beginning. I mean, you could go back to 2013, Dan, and you probably remember that conservative ad, with the sparkles, and they were playing into that right from day one, and that's just built over time to a point now where there's a substantial number of men who just they won't even listen to Justin Trudeau because they think he's everything that's against their view of what a man should be.
Time for another boxing match, I think.
So, if you're like me, you've had an EV on your mind for quite some time. I know it's good for the environment, so the next car I buy is an electric vehicle, you say. Or you hedge your bets with, or maybe the one after that. Because until the charging infrastructure is in place, you just can't commit. Well, our presenting sponsor, TELUS, is taking a lead role in helping that along. We've talked about it here, about 60 or 70 times now. TELUS operates with a laser-like focus on social purpose. They believe that doing good for people is good business, and they have a long track record of backing up that belief with investment dollars to help solve some of our most pressing challenges. Here's one of those challenges. With millions of electric vehicles predicted to be on Canadian roads in the next number of years, we need about 200,000 public chargers to be installed by 2030. So TELUS has just announced a strategic partnership with an Australian EV charging company called Jolt, because what else would they call it, eh? To install up to 5,000 fast chargers across Canada, running on the TELUS network. It's kind of a perfect marriage because these are two companies with shared values. Jolt's been working to grow EV usage around the globe with their 100% renewable energy powered technology. And TELUS is a world leader in environmental sustainability and using technology to bring a greener future. More accessible, affordable EV charging across Canada will commence almost immediately. Later this year, Jolt and TELUS begin installing their network of EV charging stations, which will include TELUS's public Wi-Fi capability. Across the network, all EV drivers will just tap their Jolt app to access 7 kilowatt hours of free charging per day, which equates to 40 to 50 kilometers of range, depending on the vehicle. You might say TELUS and Jolt are committed to a greener Canada via electric vehicles in a way that costs us a little less green. You can find out more about it all at TELUS.com. So about Poilievre for a second. Poilievre seems to me, when I watch him, that he's going after the NDP working class vote more aggressively than he's going after the Liberal vote. Is he having any success in that market? David?
I think to some extent. I mean, I was looking the other day, our latest poll, where's this Conservative vote coming from? And a small, again, we're talking about margins here, right? To Dan's point, the Conservatives are only up partially from where they were in 2021. So they're not like running the table and it's game over, but they're pulling as much from the NDP as they are from the Liberals. And so I think there is some part of that play going on. I don't know if it's, it's easily to understand in the polls because the sample sizes aren't there. But if they pick up 1 or 2 points from the New Democrats, 1 or 2 points from the Liberals, and bring some of that People's Party vote back, that's game, set, match, I think. So it is part of, I think, their strategy to appeal to that anti-establishment, working class notion that really, again, the Liberals, I think, have repelled to some extent in some of the rhetoric and choices they've made.
Yeah, we're talking
Dan,
about...
how does that change the map if Poilievre is successful at recruiting some NDP votes?
Well, I think.
Sorry, I said Dan. I think.
Sorry. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Conservatives are mapping out a plan to get to a majority or close to it, and they're counting up ridings, and I think they want to have multiple pathways to do that. That was always, I was working for the Trudeau guys. Every campaign, you're always looking for what are the different ways we can get to the number we need to get to. Maybe we get a Quebec breakthrough. Maybe not. Maybe we need something else. And I think, from the Conservative perspective, like the dream scenario for them is that the 905 just crumbles and they pick up a few seats in Atlantic Canada. But I think they have to look at other pathways too. And, there's a lot of NDP Conservative swing seats in BC, traditionally in Saskatchewan, other places where they can maybe pick up a few seats. And if you look at Jagmeet Singh, we talked about kind of personas of leaders. He again is a leader who I think appeals more to the downtown. I don't know if it's Rosedale NDP or Danforth NDP or what the term is you would use, but he's definitely like the downtown Toronto NDP type of leader, as opposed to a Charlie Angus who's going to be out there, right, appealing to the NDP voters in Northern Ontario or Saskatchewan. So again, I think there's an opportunity there just because of the way these kind of leadership personas line up that they see some potential there to pick up some votes there.
Cool. David, did you have something you want to say about that?
I was just saying, I've shared data that before about union members, right? And the Conservatives' gap right now among those that are a member of a union is 13 points. It's actually bigger than it is among non-union members, right? So there's something happening. And it's not to say the Conservatives
private sector unions or all unions?
All unions. The sample size wasn't big enough to separate it, but in the past,
but it would be much bigger among the private sector than among the public sector if you just sort of. Right? Definitely, yeah. And so that speaks to, think of the way the Conservatives kind of danced around the port strike in Vancouver, or some of the other labor. They haven't been as aggressively back to work, I think, as conservative governments or parties have been in the past. And I think it's because they're trying to win places like London, Windsor. Think of those mid-sized cities where there's a substantial Hamiltons. I mean, may be too far gone, but I think they're definitely thinking about how do we play into those places. And it comes back to that unionized blue collar male voter that is culturally closer to the Conservatives, but maybe economically closer to where the Liberals and the New Democrats traditionally have been. Okay. So, David, I'm going to pick up on something you've been hinting about out there as a topic, which is, as we mentioned earlier, Trudeau's favorable, unfavorable has gone from an even tie in the 2021 election to a 20-point negative spread today. Do you think the Liberals would be better off with another leader?
I don't know if there's an answer that you can, based on research, come to a conclusion about, right? I think the question in my mind comes to, I think for the last year, it's been the risk of replacing him is far higher than the risk of keeping him. I'm not sure that's the case anymore when I look at some of these numbers, right? We won't know how the public reacts to pretty much any other Liberal leader because none of them have the profile, anywhere near the profile of the Prime Minister. And so it's a really
There's no
risky...
obvious heir apparent as there has been sometimes in the past, and even those obvious heir apparents sometimes don't do as well as they're projected to do. Right? Exactly.
So if I ask Canadians about Chrystia Freeland or Francois Champagne or Melanie Joly, Chrystia Freeland is known, but not well known. The others, nobody has any idea who they are, right? Even if they recognize the name. And so
Quebec, rest of Canada split on that. Like, for instance, Jolie's pretty well known in Quebec, but not at all known in English Canada, right?
Right. And so anytime about a year ago, I ran a trial, like hypothetical, what if Chrystia Freeland, what if Melanie Joly, what if Anita Anand were leader of the Liberals? How would you vote? Well, guess what? The Liberals get destroyed in all those cases. Not, I think, because Canadians are rejecting those choices as leaders, because they don't know who they are and they go to the familiar, which they went to in Quebec, more of the Bloc, if it was somebody outside Quebec they didn't know, or they went to the New Democrats. So back to the original question, David, I don't know the answer. But I think there's probably some MPs in that Liberal caucus who are asking that question right now. The problem is, if we're using any available like actual voting behavior, it's the by-elections prove otherwise, right? These are examples of where voters had a choice and they actually didn't punish the Liberals the same way that the polling suggests they might.
Right. Dan, do you have a take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of comes down to what type of change voters want. If voters are just sick of Justin Trudeau, but they love everything else about the Liberal agenda, you could make an argument that maybe somebody else would be better then. It's different musicians singing the same song can sometimes take off. We see that with Fast Car right now, and if they love the song, then maybe someone else would actually have a catchy beat that they would gravitate to. But if they don't like the song or they have issues with the song, I don't think that would be the case right now. And I mean, the other numbers David shared there, direction of the country is not great, direction of the government. Bringing in somebody who is a member of that government probably isn't going to be able to show change when it comes to those types of questions, those types of agenda policy type of questions there. I think there's also the kind of four-dimensional question about what happens in an actual election campaign, right? And we know, and this is something that Scott Reed talks about a lot on your other podcast there, Justin Trudeau has shown he's a good campaigner, or at least he can elevate himself and bring that A game. We don't know that about the other leaders yet. We don't know how they would perform in a debate, doing 4 events for 30 days in a row. So that's a bit of an open question as well, too, I think. And the other one that I kind of pause on is the Conservatives have raised a lot of money, and they are going to run a big pre-writ ad campaign. And they are running a big pre-writ ad campaign against Justin Trudeau. I think his negatives are already kind of known. Canadians already know how they feel about him. I don't think that changes him too much. But, that big cannon lined up against the next Liberal leader who is undefined, I think could actually have a big impact the same way it kind of took several other Liberal leaders through the laundry in past cycles as well, too. So I think there's a risk that, someone comes in, they're undefined. Obviously, they'd have an opportunity to define themselves, but the Conservatives will have a big target, I think, to try to knock them down as well too, which is a big risk for the Liberals. And as David's numbers showed, when that other experiment he mentioned there's a much lower floor, I think, with somebody else, and maybe that gives Jagmeet Singh an opportunity to rise up as well too. You never know.
So right about now, new federal ministers will be getting their mandate letters. Essentially, these directives are marching orders from the Prime Minister. They lay out what the minister is expected to achieve. Some leaders fight to keep mandate letters secret. Prime Minister Trudeau makes his public. They'll all be posted online, ready for inspection. Anyway, we now have a new Minister of Transport, and our sponsor, CN, would like to gently suggest a mandate letter for the Honourable Pablo Rodriguez. Here goes. First, Minister, when you contemplate issues in your portfolio, like the new supply chain office, railway safety, and partnering on labour policies, please take a fact-based approach, one driven by data. Supply chains are a continuum. To properly and smoothly function, all the parts have to collaborate and move in unison. So-called fixes like extended interest switching, and we would be glad to discuss that, create negative unintended consequences. If all the supply chain players provide transparent data the way CN does, a reliable coordinated end-to-end system can be built. It would make maximum use of labor and assets, and it would improve safety. Canada's productivity is ailing, Minister. Requiring disclosure of data and then putting it to good use would be immensely helpful. Second, Minister, it remains impossible to load grain onto ships at the Port of Vancouver when it's raining, and it rains a lot in Vancouver. Trains sit idle, ships sit unloaded, everything backs up, people get angry, and money is lost. Surely the Government of Canada, working with stakeholders, can solve this. If governments can work with the private sector to develop a COVID vaccine, We can figure out how to keep grain dry until it's in a ship's hold. Third, Minister, you are part of a government committed to green policies. CN is all in. Rail is already by far the most efficient form of land transport, but we need to go further. We need robust funding for research, development, and deployment of sustainable locomotive fuels and alternative propulsion technologies. CN has other ideas, but that's the gist for now. We stand ready to help. Welcome again, Minister. May the road rise to greet you. You know, Dan, I think that you and I are among the two people who've thought most in the country about the electoral calculations of the Liberal Party. We're up there about it. Let me put a controversial proposition to you that I have come to believe through hard experience. The Liberals can't win an election without a French-Canadian leader. Not a French-speaking leader, a French-Canadian leader. Because when we have an Anglo as our leader, no matter how good their French is, no matter how long they've lived in Quebec, we get 20 seats in Quebec, not 40. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. Like if you look at there haven't been a lot of counter points. I mean, Michael Ignatieff may not be the best example of a leader if you're trying to take a case study otherwise.
Yeah, but Paul Martin,
yeah.
John Turner.
Yeah, that's fair. Look, I think the math is such that as long as the Liberals are uncompetitive in Western Canada, they do need Quebec. I think that's a reality. And I think we probably have talked about this many times before about, how self-damaging it is that the Liberals cannot be competitive in Western Canada. If they could win a couple seats in urban Saskatchewan or Calgary or Edmonton, it would make the math a lot easier in the other parts of the country as well too. And especially when you look at every redistribution, there's another 3 seats coming to Alberta and another seat coming to BC, and maybe Quebec manages to arm wrestle another seat out because of other reasons. But that's where the map is moving, right? So if the Liberals cannot compete at the level that they need to in those other parts of the country, they need Quebec, and Quebecers have shown a tendency to prefer a Quebecer generally when they have those options on the table. It's certainly been that way for a long time, and maybe someone else could break that history, but I wouldn't dispute that to a large extent.
Let's switch leaders' perspectives to Poilievre. I think there is a belief in Liberal circles that at the end of the day, Poilievre is too extreme to win. That his dalliances with the convoy occupation of Ottawa and with crypto bros and other things are all going to make Canadians recoil at the end of the day from making him the Prime Minister. Do you, either of you, start with you, David, see any evidence of that?
Not right now, actually. I think I think that's I would tend to agree with that hypothesis. And one thing I just recently did is I tried to identify a subset of the electorate that would be most informed, right? Would be following closely enough that their conclusion might lead them to that. So I found this kind of group of 40% of Canadians who I think are sort of the informed subset. And when you look at what they think about Poilievre, it's not fundamentally different from what the general public does. They're just a little more informed, but they're not more negative. So that leads me to believe that it may not be true. I mean, I don't know if you can bet on that happening. But I do think, on the other hand, there's this large group, about 34% of Canadians, who say they want change, but they're not comfortable with the alternatives. They're not completely comfortable with the alternatives, which signals to me that if the Conservatives think they're going to win this election by doubling down and speaking to that more aggressive, more conservative base, I think they're making a real mistake. And I do think there's a high likelihood that when people come to make a choice, even if they think it's time for a change, even if they're not enamored with Justin Trudeau, they don't love him anymore. And David, you know this better probably than anybody. In the 2014 election that you ran, or the one just prior in Ontario, 2011, Donald McGuinty should have lost 2011, and Kathleen Wynne, I think, should have lost 2014. But ultimately, the alternatives were so unacceptable that people went back to the safer choice. I think that could happen, and the Conservatives are going to blow another chance to win an election.
Well, that's my view of how the only way that old governments can win is to make their alternative, render their alternative unacceptable. Because if you're even just okay, you're going to win. Yeah. Dan, do you see a shiv that can be stuck into Poilievre in the campaign the way we did it to Harper in 2004 or did it to Scheer in 2019?
Yeah, I mean, I think Poilievre certainly is somebody who puts himself out there and leads with his chin, and I think he's going to leave some targets as a result of that. I mean, he was out there cheering on the convoy as they arrived in Ottawa. And I'm not saying that would be an issue I would necessarily raise in the campaign, but I think it speaks to his kind of character as somebody who, because he is playing to that base and because he seems unafraid of taking those types of positions, I think he will create some opportunities for the Liberals to counterpunch. I think O'Toole certainly tried to shift back to the middle and play himself up as a moderate, and that caused me a lot of sleepless nights for 2 weeks. And in the end, it didn't pan out. But I think, Poilievre's not going to do that. I think it's pretty clear that he's going to run as a legit conservative with conservative views and, not apologize for the positions he's taken. So, whether it's, cuts or healthcare or anything else, I think there'll be some opportunities there. I really liked when Sean Fraser was on your podcast a couple of weeks ago talking about, Poilievre has come out and basically said he's going to cut CPP and it hasn't got a lot of attention. But if we're talking about older voters again, like that's something that could be a wedge with him. So I think there'll be opportunities there. And I think, the Liberals will have to hit him pretty hard because, as you said, it's hard to win a fourth mandate unless people are disqualifying the opposition.
And so do you think you'd go after him, David, do you think you'd go after him on policy grounds or on character grounds? Like he hangs around with weird people and you can't trust what he says about this, the issue or that issue? Or would you go after him? He's going to cancel the CPP. He's going to undo dental care, whatever these kinds of things. Is he more vulnerable as a wingnut or as a conservative?
I think you go after both. I actually think the convoy is fruitful ground to remind people that this was somebody who was out there taking pictures with people that only 20% of the Canadians, empathize with or agreed with. Like, this is the vast majority, including half of Conservatives, who said, I don't like any of those people. I don't think they're doing the right thing. But I think it sticks by making him feel reckless, right? That he's doing it for the wrong reasons, that it's simply vengeance, or this was, he's got this grand vision of a conservative, as he likes to say, the freest country in the world. Well, what does that mean? It means, as Dan said, cuts to CPP. It means cuts to healthcare. He wants to get inflation under control, he says, by cutting and cutting and cutting. Well, what is he going to cut? So I really do think there's a lot of risk there. And I come back to I think of other examples around the world. I think, this is a perfect example, a different political orientation where the Conservatives need to reassure voters, not convince them that change is what they want. Voters are convinced they want change. They just aren't convinced the Conservatives are the right change for them. And the more that they go out there and say things that just are unconventional or uncomfortable, I think it just adds risk to the proposition of a vote for the Conservatives, especially at a time, by the way, voters are unhappy, they're anxious, but that means they're also very defensive. So as much as they want change, when we ask a follow-up question, what kind of change do you want? Only half the country says, I want big change. They want change, but they don't want like a fundamental reset because they're already dealing with a lot of change in their lives.
Right. So I'm going to have to talk about this whole business with Jordan Leichnitz on the Curse of Politics. So let's talk about the NDP for a minute. They're hanging around at around 18-19% in everybody's data. Sometimes they pop up above 20. Sometimes they're as low as 17, but they're in that range and consistently in that range. Do you think that's what they'll get on election day, or do you see pitfalls or opportunities for them going forward, Dan?
I mean, they've had trouble holding their vote every other election, the last couple of years. And part of that is just their voters are younger and don't turn out to the same numbers. But I do think, David mentioned the by-elections, I think that's a good kind of case study there, where when voters have to kind of make that decision, ultimately, if the NDP is not somebody they see as being viable, they lose support naturally, which is to be expected. So I think, the Liberals and Conservatives, if this is a big epic clash between, Justin Trudeau and his fourth final election, maybe against Pierre Poilievre, and they're not running to the middle, and they're actually like slugging it out, to continue our boxing analogy there. That's going to be the one people are paying attention to, and I think if it really is seen as a really decisive, gulf between the two of them, a lot of NDP voters will vote Liberal, because if you look at the kind of the crosstabs, like NDP voters are not the ones who've turned on Trudeau to the same extent. Conservatives, it's hard to find a conservative in the country who likes anything about Justin Trudeau. You can find a lot of NDP voters who at least are, on side with some of his policy agenda, even at a personal level, like him a bit more. So, I think there's certainly some potential for some of those NDP voters to vote Liberal in that, in an election that is that polarized.
So you're envisioning a situation which they get squeezed on both ends. They get squeezed in Port Alberni and Northern Ontario by the Conservatives, and they get squeezed in the 905 and Lower Mainland by us.
Yeah, I mean that's the great fear of every NDP operative, I'm sure, and the great hope of Liberals pretty much every campaign. Is that squeeze play on the NDP.
Right.
And David, just to reiterate what Dan just said, like 30% of New Democrat voters right now, people say they'd vote New Democrat, like Justin Trudeau. They have a positive impression of him. Only 4% of conservatives say the same thing, right? So there is a subset of goodwill among some New Democrats that you can imagine those 30% saying, well, who do I like more? Who do I like least? Well, for them, it's Pierre Poilievre potentially. And so I think the fundamentals are there for that squeeze to happen in a much more polarized election than we've had in the last two rounds. Aaron O'Toole wasn't scary, I think, to NDP voters as Pierre Poilievre could be, and is increasingly becoming.
Right. And I mean, Singh implicitly has, endorsed this government to some extent, right, in terms of the supply agreements. So it's harder for him to say this government has ruined your lives when he's been co-signing the checks, right?
Do you see any evidence that they are getting credit for things that they brought to the coalition, like, say, dental care? Do Canadians think that they can thank the NDP for the fact that there's a dental care program?
I don't see it. I think generally, if you ask people, do they like that program? They do. Do they know that it's only there because the NDP insisted on it? I don't think most people are aware of that. I think if they get any credit, it's that we didn't have an election earlier than we might have. But most people need to really understand that, and I don't think they're paying that close attention.
Is anybody getting any credit for these things? So the government has spent a shitload of money on childcare and dental care in this mandate. Are they getting any? Where are the votes for that? I don't see it in the polls. Where are the votes for those things?
I mean, ultimately, these are things that don't impact a lot of people directly. I think if you have two kids in childcare, you're noticing for sure it's going to make a big difference in your lives. But run the census figures on the number of Canadians who have kids in that age range, and it's not a large number. And same thing, I don't think dental care is necessarily impacting a ton of people directly. So it's the sort of thing where, I think there's a bit of impact if it's something that helps you personally, but it's a limited program. If you're writing checks to every senior in the country, there's a lot of votes there. Not as many if you're targeting these things to those types of audiences.
But Dan, these programs are in the litany of government defenses on the cost of living. When the government defends itself on what it's doing about cost of living, it rhymes off those two programs. And what you're saying is the vast majority of people hear that and they go, well, that doesn't have anything to do with me. It's not going to change my situation one bit.
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem right now, is that not enough people have seen this government responding to the cost of living crisis. You look at the history of the Trudeau government. First mandate, the big crisis was Donald Trump. And this was a government that was seen to be all in. We're dealing with this. We're taking this on. We're taking Trump on. And they got the result with NAFTA. They had Canadians' backs there. Second mandate, the crisis was COVID. And people were people were setting their watches to watch the Prime Minister speak every day, and they connected, and they knew he was on top of the issue, and he got the vaccines for us, and actually there was some deliverables there. And I think, the big problem right now, we talked about this at a high level earlier with the economy, the big problem is people don't see the government necessarily all in solving this cost of living crisis, and they don't necessarily feel like they've got my back the same way they did, I think, previously. And it's tough because there's probably nothing the government can do to solve the housing crisis in the short term. I mean, you have your smart person panel with Tyler Meredith and other people who can maybe give you some solutions, but I think even they would agree that, there aren't a lot of easy fixes, and a lot of the fixes that involve writing checks to people probably make the situation worse, right? So, I think that's part of the challenge here, is that not enough people have seen that kind of direct. They're not getting the CERB. When you had 8 million people getting the CERB, they felt that directly. And, here it's a much smaller number of people who are directly benefiting from, the grocery rebate or dental care or childcare. So I think that's part of the challenge. And that's probably part of the reason the numbers are a little bit softer right now.
Is there room, David, for the Liberals to move back to the policy center and push the Conservatives back? Or do they need to hunker down into this sort of progressive left positioning that they've got right now and battle it out on ideological terms with the government?
I don't know if
with the Conservatives. Sorry, no.
I don't even think either of those actually, David, are the path they should take. I think they just need to make the Conservatives completely unacceptable to people. I think that's the only way, back to our original point we made, that they win this. There's very little they can do, to Dan's point, to solve the three biggest issues that people identify. I mean, they spent a ton of money on healthcare already. What else can they do on that issue? They can't build 1 million homes in a year, so they can't solve the housing crisis overnight. And the cost of living, it's out of their control very much about what the Bank of Canada does next, and whether they keep increasing rates that puts further pressure on people. They can't. I was looking back to history. I mean, you can go back to the 1974 federal election, and the Conservatives pull out price and wage controls. Well, then maybe we can have a debate on how we do it. But nobody's going to, no one goes there anymore and is going to bring that idea up. So there's literally nothing the Liberals, I think, can do except start revving the engines of, it could be far worse, folks. It could be far worse. And to your point about, the government defending its record by pointing to those past programs, not only do they affect so few people, but so few people even know about them, right? And so if you're going to make the reason why we shouldn't elect Pierre Poilievre because he's going to eliminate the childcare national program, which, by the way, I don't think they're going to go there. But even if they did, most people are saying, well, I don't care. That's not going to affect me. On the other hand, Pierre Poilievre's out there saying, I'm going to get rid of the carbon tax, which, by the way, I think is a big reason why the Conservatives and the Liberals are now tied in Atlantic Canada, is because that took place in some of those provinces in Nova Scotia. So Pierre Poilievre is offering a cross-the-board cut to something everybody pays, pretty much, except maybe Chrystia Freeland, which is gas.
So if everybody died, and I had to be in charge of the next Liberal campaign, one of the questions I would be asking myself is whether we should postpone further increases in the carbon tax. And I would be asking myself whether that would be seen as responsiveness and a reach out to people that are struggling, or whether that would be seen as craven politics undermining one of our core pledges and lead to the bottom falling out. It could go either way. What would you think, Dan?
Honestly, I think Poilievre's going to attack you on the carbon tax either way, whether or not it's $200 or $300. I don't think anybody knows how big the carbon tax is right now. People know there's a carbon tax, but they would have no idea what it is, or even that it's going up necessarily at the rate it's going up because of gas prices fluctuating. So I think you're going to get attacked on it either way. So I think it's better off to at least make sure you're not seen as completely abandoning your principles, and you keep that environmental cohort, which is still there. I mean, I think there's still Canadians who are going to care about those issues, especially if we're talking about NDP voters to collapse over. I think, if you were being completely politically crass about it and say, we could have never brought in the carbon tax in the first place, I think, that is one that was never brought in for electoral reasons. It's certainly not something that was done to win elections. It's something that was done for, the good of the planet and to meet climate targets. And I think there's no way to really undo it at this point. So I think all you can really do is offer something else. I mean, you could maybe offer some other kind of rebate or, cost of living help. Use the revenue from they're using the revenue from the carbon tax to give people rebates. So maybe there's a way to repackage that that's a bit more direct. But I just don't think you get any credit for going halfway on this sort of thing. Like you already got the carbon tax, you might as well follow through with it.
I did a survey where I asked people in a forced choice whether they would prefer lower personal or sales taxes or further reducing emissions in greenhouse gas causing emissions in Canada. And among that 30 to 60-year-old cohort, it was a beating in favor of lower taxes.
Yeah, I mean, that's why there's a rebate for the carbon tax too, right? So I think, government can maybe talk a bit more about that, try to emphasize it.
People don't understand this concept, Dan. You've researched the shit out of this. Confirm this for me. The business of how the carbon tax is supposed to work to reduce emissions and to leave more money in your pocket, people don't understand that.
Fair to say market pressures are not something all Canadians have studied in their economics courses in university. And it is a little counterintuitive to some people. Like you take money away, you give it back. At least though it is money that's coming back, right? And if you can make the case that Poilievre is going to take away your $700 or $800, I think that's probably more compelling than try to explain how dropping emissions by 2% below targets from 1990 is going to, people can get more lost if you kind of get into the actual, how this will help. So I think at least the rebate is something that could be seen as a tangible and speaks to cost of living. So I think, embracing the rebate and shining a spotlight on that is probably the best way to deal with it. And then, try to proactively talk about other things you've done in the environment that are more popular, like, planting trees. If we can get a few more trees in the ground, banning plastics, these are things that people do understand, right? They understand how that is going to help the environment more. So I think there's an environmental story still to be told there, even if the carbon tax is not as compelling to most Canadians.
David, do you have a different take on my question? Would you back off the carbon tax if you were the Liberals?
No, I don't think so. I think, and I look at some of the data, the one area where the Liberals are strong is on climate and the environment. When you ask people, which party's best able to handle it, that they have, strikingly defined the Liberal brand around that. And I think if you step away from that, because people associate the carbon tax, probably the most high profile measure around climate action, it exposes you, one, to Dan's point, as being inconsistent, and again, doing what's politically expedient. And two, it creates space for the New Democrats or the Greens to come in and take 1 or 2 points from those who care deeply about climate. So I don't think it helps. People who are voting because of the carbon tax are never going to vote Liberal. Whether they cut it or reduce it or eliminate it, it's never going to be their voter anyways.
And I will say, in the last election campaign, getting the endorsements from Andrew Weaver, the former Green leader in BC, some of the other groups there, that was stuff. We were running digital ads that were targeted towards Liberal, NDP, Green, swing voters in a lot of BC ridings and a lot of other places on the environment as an issue. So, I think, in defense of the carbon tax, it has been helpful in getting that kind of upper environmental class buy-in, which is something you can use as sort of we're legit on the environment. These other people say we're legit on the environment. If you care about this issue, vote for us. And there are places, especially in BC, where that will still make a difference.
Okay. So the Conservatives, I read this morning, have a campaign ready to go to brand Pierre Poilievre. TV, digital, radio. They're coming out with a big $3 million campaign to tell us all about Pierre Poilievre. If you were designing that campaign for them, what would you tell people about Poilievre? What do they need people to hear about Poilievre? David?
I think they need to hear, I think you have to start with the idea, if you've done any research on this, that most people don't really know who he is. They don't know where he's from. They've seen him around, they've heard him, but they don't know who he is. So you have to tell his story. And almost start from there, right? Recognizing that those who don't like him aren't going to like him tomorrow because you've convinced them, and those who like him aren't going to move the other way. So it's the 30%, 40% of people who don't have an opinion about him or only notionally know him. So I think you've got to tell the story. You've got to, but most important, in my mind, is it comes down to motivation. Like, why do you want to be prime minister? What do you want to do with that power? How do you see the country, 10 years from now? That's what I would do, because I think that's what's missing. I think, frankly, from the Liberals right now is like, what's next? And two is to make him a safe, reassuring choice for people. They have to know where he comes from and what's driving him to want to be prime minister.
I mean, I think in terms of what I would not do, I think he certainly can come across a bit too negative. And if they don't feel they need to necessarily drive up Trudeau's negatives right now, because they're already high, I don't think they need to go there necessarily. And, I've also seen a lot of his videos he's put out where he looks like the cash for money guy. He's like jumping around and screaming. And like, I think something that seems a bit safer, that seems a bit more comfortable is probably a good persona for him. I also think that his biggest vulnerability is probably going to be this idea that he's heartless. He doesn't care, right? That he's just thinking of the bottom line. So he's going to take away your pensions or cut your health care, as we talked about. So, it's something that kind of connects him to, I'm in this for the right reasons. I care about Canadians. What's the story to explain, why he's doing this? Not just because I graduated. I wanted to be prime minister since I was in grade 6 and found a safe riding I could run in as soon as I got out of university. I've been a politician my whole life. That maybe not the most compelling story. So, I think he's going to have to try to tell a bit about why he's in this to help people and make their lives better. And do that in probably a bit of a softer way that's doesn't turn anybody off. Doesn't have to be as aggressive as he is on social media.
Just on that, Dan, on my last survey, I asked people which between Trudeau and Poilievre, which do you feel is the strongest, the most compassionate, the clearest vision for Canada, has the best ideas, best represents your values. On everything, Trudeau and Poilievre are more or less equal on the strongest, on the best ideas, on the most relevant for today, on best represents your values. But on the most compassionate, Trudeau has a 14-point advantage over Poilievre. And I don't think you need to be the most compassionate to win an election, especially if you're conservative.
But you need to be compassionate.
You got to close that gap. People got to believe you're at least somewhat compassionate. And so, Dan, I think you're right. I think they've got to connect with people on that level to say he's not this ruthless, vengeful kind of leader is just going to chop the shit out of, everything that I care about. And he doesn't have to out compassion Trudeau, but he's got to at least be in the ballpark, I think.
So let's try to bring this thing full circle then. I mean, if you're thinking about this from the Liberals' perspective, they've got a situation where the issue set's a bit upside down. The things they're seen as being good at are relatively unimportant to people right now. And the things that are relatively important to people right now, they're not seen as being very good at, and in some cases, not very interested in. And they're in a position now where they would lose possibly a majority Conservative government, and the trend lines are bad, and history's against it. So you're trying to map a turnaround play here. Do you have to figure out a way, if you're the Liberal campaign, do you have to figure out a way to win the cost of living fight? Or do you have to figure out a way to have an election that isn't about the cost of living?
I think you need an election that's not about the cost of living. Like, if that's the ballot question, it seems like it'll be difficult to win that ballot question. And, time is something that can maybe help in that respect. Let's deal with the NDP if they can keep it together for another 2 years. And I don't think the NDP is going to be in a rush to get into a campaign for both, financial, organizational reasons. And
although this thing is killing them, let's be honest. This deal is killing them.
The Liberals?
The NDP.
Oh, yeah. But I mean, I don't know if the NDP is in a rush for an election because, if Jagmeet doesn't make a big step forward this election, like, he's gone as their leader too. So I don't think he's got necessarily the incentive structure, and their poll numbers are not through the roof right now either. So I think there's a way to keep this together for 2 years. And maybe that helps a bit on the cost of living front if another issue takes over in the future. But I think, as David said, Poilievre has to at least not get crushed on compassion. I think Trudeau has to make sure that he's not getting crushed on this issue here. He has to at least be seen as, empathetic, and this is kind of speaks to compassion in some respects, right? If you're seen as being out of touch on cost of living, what people are going through, that undercuts your strength in an issue where people care about, right? So I think the key for the government is not necessarily to solve the issue, because they're not going to be able to solve it, but at least leave people with the sense that they care about the issue. They're doing things to help. They get what people are going through. They've got your back. And I think that is probably in the fall what I would say needs to come back as kind of the key message of the Trudeau government.
David, I think I may be quoting your polling, but if I'm not, I'm sorry. But I thought I saw somewhere that there's a 30-point gap between Poilievre and Trudeau, or between the Conservatives and the Liberals, on economic management, on managing the economy. And based on my experience, you can't win in that circumstance, because you don't necessarily, there's certain parts of the economy the Conservatives, just based on brand, are always going to win. They're always going to be seen as better fiscal managers, with the exception of 1996. And they're always going to be seen as in favor of lower taxes more than Liberals, and a few things. But there's other aspects of the economy, creating jobs and better quality jobs, etc., where Liberals can compete and beat Conservatives. And I've always believed that the Liberals have to have core economic credibility in some area to win an election. You can't just win on social policy versus economic policy, or climate policy versus economic policy. One of the reasons the NDP don't win is because people don't trust them with the economy. And so it feels to me like the Liberals have to find some economic story between now and the next election that gives people confidence that they can continue to entrust the economy in their hands.
Well, I think to Dan's point, it's time. I think they need time to demonstrate that we're out of the worst of it, that we released numbers last week that showed majority of Canadians think inflation in Canada is higher than it is in other comparable countries around the world. It's the complete opposite of that, right? Inflation is actually one of the lowest in Canada. So their story isn't even getting out, which has been not as bad as other places, right? You'd much rather be the Liberals in Canada than the Tories in the UK, or right?
For several reasons, yeah.
but just simply on inflation and and then a whole bunch of economic reasons, right? So. And so, yeah, I think, David, you're right. They can't win this election alone. But on the other hand, I don't think a Liberal majority government's in the cards. And I'm not convinced that in 2019 or 2021, based on the data I've seen, that the Liberals owned any economic issues in those ones. But those elections turned on something else. Dan, I've got you sitting here. I still believe that if those blackface photos hadn't come out in 2019, Andrew Scheer would have won that election, because it was about the cost of living, and the Liberals were light years away from the Conservatives, even back then, on that issue. So I hate to pump up Scott Reid, because
do it. He loves it.
His ego is already amazingly big, but something he said a few weeks ago.
It's one of the biggest things about him.
I love him. One of the things he said on Crystal Politics a few weeks ago, David, was you've got, he was pointing to the 88 election, right? What do you need to do to make the next election about something big that you can have a debate about, that's not piddling around? And cost of living is a big issue, but it's something you can't really solve. You can't have a real debate around the cost of living, but you can find another issue to do it. So I do think that's what they've got to find. They've got to find something that creates a sharp, clear, big divide between the Conservatives. Climate change could be the issue, by the way. It's rising as a concern about, and if this extreme weather events continue to happen in all parts of the country, it could be that issue where the Conservatives are incredibly vulnerable on that issue. So I agree, David, that they have to probably be better on the economy, but I don't think they're going to find any chance of turning that around. So they need to find something else to fight about.
It sounds like more blackface photos is what's needed based on your assessment there, David.
Anything, change the channel, by God.
Yeah. I think it had that effect in 2019. As much as it probably was incredibly stressful for you, Dan, in those first few days. The poll numbers didn't go down afterwards. I'll say that. So it forced us, the voters, to assess the leaders through a different lens. So before they were being asked to ask about which of these are going to lower my cost of living, then it was which of these guys are actually racist or not. And I think Andrew Scheer lost that fight.
Yeah. Okay, guys. This has been a very stimulating conversation. A lot of for people to chew on here. Any last thoughts before we go? Anything that you're really seeing that's interesting that we haven't got to yet?
I'll just chime in. I've been paying a little more attention to immigration. I think that's a sleeper issue that the Conservatives may be recognizing the opportunity there, that it connects to housing, it connects to cost of living, it connects to healthcare. And I think, anyone listening or watching this podcast who thinks that, the elite consensus on immigration in Canada is something that we will never see broken, I think they're wrong, because the public opinion data that I'm seeing suggests people are not turning to xenophobia, but they are worried that we're letting too many people in and it's having a big effect on the things they count on.
And if Poilievre was to say we are going to cut that 500,000 in half, people wouldn't say he was xenophobic for doing that, right? That would be seen as a reasonable thing to do given the pressures on the system
Absolutely.
right now.
That's what I just released some data on my Substack that's found exactly that response.
Yeah. Dan?
Yeah, I think on that point, I think it just shows that, 2 years is a long time in politics. 2 years ago, we were talking about COVID. 2 years before that, environment was a big issue. 2 years before that, Trump was a big issue. Maybe it will be immigration, maybe climate change, maybe something else. And I think, for Liberals who are feeling despondent at the current polls, McGuinty, Christy Clark went through this as well on route to their final victories. Things can change quickly, right? And Poilievre is not defined yet. So I think how Poilievre gets defined and how the back half of this mandate go, could change things quite quickly. Just because it's 10 points today, it could be worse in 2 years. That's certainly a possibility too. But I wouldn't say the next election is a foregone conclusion that Poilievre is going to win at this point, given that he is an untested leader, right? Things can happen to untested leaders in their first election campaign.
62-23 were the numbers in 1983. 62-23.
Wow.
So yeah, it can be worse.
On that cheery note.
Yeah, on that cheery note. Well, anyway, it was great. We'll have you back. Thanks for doing this. And thank you to everybody who watched or listened to this show. And boy, we're going to be firing up this conversation on the Curse of Politics this week as well. So check that out. And I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, our sponsor, CN Rail, and David and Dan for their time. Thank you very much, gentlemen. It was a great conversation.
Really enjoyed it.
Glad to be here.